recording it. So even if this one's bad, we're going to stick with it. Here's your PowerPoint. This is a lecture on stress and health. I told you before the break that we needed to squish this in somewhere. I had skipped it earlier because I didn't have a good place for it. You probably forgot all about that, but here it is, stress and health. We'll start off with an exam question from a previous exam. If you don't want to hear the answer right away and you want time to answer it, then pause it now. So the answer to this one is B, your ability to predict and control potential stressors. Try one more. Which of the following is the phase of Salier's general adaptation syndrome, wherein individuals are most vulnerable to illness, collapse, and even death? Appraisal, alarm, exhaustion, denial, resistance. Go ahead and pause it now if you want time to think about it. And the answer is exhaustion. You may have guessed that, but you definitely need to know Salier's theory. It's likely to get a question or two on it. Well, at least one. Here's an outline I'm going to talk about: the definitions of stress, the outside events that can cause stress, and the different ways we respond. What should you know? You should know the two theories of stress and the effects of stress on us psychologically and physically. You should know what stress is, the terms distress and eustress, types of stressors, the scale called the SRRS, Salier's adaptation syndrome, coping with stress, and personality types in stress. What is stress? Well, what do you think? So I'll give you a chance to think about it. Stress is actually not something that comes from outside. It is our response to those outside events, so to challenging or threatening events, kind of like when Scar threatens Mufasa. Those responses can be physical, like fatigue or problem sleeping or even colds or chest pains. They can be emotional, and you know what the emotional responses would be. They can be cognitive, like problems concentrating or making decisions or remembering things. And they can be behavioral, like overeating or crying too much or smoking too much or lashing out physically at somebody. So let's start with the stressors. The stressors are the external events that threaten or challenge us. They're put into three types: big, medium, and little. So the big ones are catastrophes, then there are major life changes, and then there are daily hassles. An important thing to note that might not be obvious till you think about it is that stressors can be negative or positive events. So unpleasant events cause distress, positive events cause eustress, and that's was a term coined by that guy Hans Selye in 1937. It's the term eustress now means the optimal level of stress people need for their health and well-being. So that's the first concept you might need to file away. More on stressors. Catastrophes are unpredictable, large-scale stress events that create tremendous need to adapt, or they present some kind of overwhelming threat. More common would be major life changes that everybody goes through, and these can be both negative and positive. Thomas Holmes and Richard Rahe said that any event that causes you to adapt or change your lifestyle will result in stress, whether it's positive or negative. They created something called the Social Readjustment Rating Scale. This measures the amount of stress in a person's life by scoring and adding up all the life change units they encounter. On the next slide, I show you an example of it. The book also has it. There is a college version, the CUS, or College Undergraduate Stress Scale, and because college students have a different set of stressors, it can calculate that for you, and I've got a version of that too, and the book also shows it to you in case you want to see how stressful your junior or senior year of high school are. And then there are the daily annoyances, frustrations, delays, irritations, minor disagreements. There's also something called a Hassel scale that will calculate how much kind of superficial stress you have in your life. And what's interesting is, while the SRRS can predict how big of a life crisis you are in, which is a big predictor of your risk of illness or actually having an accident. The Hassel scale is more likely to predict short-term problems like getting a headache or a backache or cold or infection. But the SRRS is by far the more important scale. Here's the SRRS. You kind of answer all these questions and see and add it up, and you can see at the bottom, if you're at 150 or less, it means you have no significant problems. 150 to 200 is some kind of mild life crisis. 200 to 300 is a moderate life crisis, and over 300 means you're dealing with a lot of stuff all at once. That's the college undergraduate scale. And now we get to our response. And that is, of course, Count Rugen from Princess Bride. There's physiological. Let's start with that. How does stress affect the physiological functioning of the body and its immune system? So stress involves the autonomic nervous system, if you remember that. And the autonomic nervous system has two sides. Before I tell you, can you remember which system is activated when we encounter stress? Correct. That is the sympathetic nervous system, or our fight or flight. And if you remember the movie Princess Bride well, this is when Count Rugen encounters Inigo Montoya and decides to flee. So he does the flight part. Hans Selye came up with the general adaptation syndrome, which is his theory of how our body responds to stress. And according to him, it doesn't matter what the stressor is, that whether it's a weather catastrophe or hunger or something that affects you emotionally, that our body responds in the same way. And it doesn't matter if it's targeting the whole body or part of the body. Some criticism of Selye's theory is that it's too simplistic and that our body does actually respond differently to different kinds of stress, but this is still generally accepted as the basic model. It has three stages: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. And in the alarm stage, our nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system, gets activated. And when the stressor occurs, we actually are more vulnerable in that first stage of shock. And then as our body responds, our resistance rises. And what's going to happen there is the adrenal glands are going to release hormones like cortisol and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, that are going to increase your heart rate, raise your blood pressure, and elevate your blood sugar, giving you a burst of energy. If the stressor or threat is prolonged, then the body will eventually adjust. You can't stay in alarm stage forever. You'll quickly deplete all of your energy. So in the resistance stage, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in a little bit and limits the demands on the body, like your heart and your lungs will not work as vigorously. But the body is still operating at a very elevated level and is still responding to this threat. And this is when your resistance to the threat is going to peak and be sustained. Eventually, the threat is diminished, or you will not be able to maintain that. And that's when you enter the exhaustion phase. And your body's reserves are depleted, and your ability to kind of restore worn out tissue is diminished. And this is when in the exhaustion phase, stress is linked to a variety of infectious diseases that are opportunistic because your immune system is actually compromised. And if you think about, I think the book has an example of a firefighter responding to an emergency, and in the initial phase they're in the alarm phase, and if the blaze lasts for a long number of hours, they move into a resistance phase. But eventually, if they're going on 2-3 days, they're going to not be able to maintain that response and get exhaustion. And this can also go on in a more chronic way, not in a space of a day or hours, but over weeks and months. The physiological effects of stress over the long term would be increased risk of heart disease, diabetes. The immune system can get suppressed, and that can lead to a higher risk of cancer and susceptibility to infection. So that, just so you're clear, that's probably one of the biggest things to know from this lecture. Our emotional and cognitive response is more obvious, that emotionally we're going to have the negative emotions of frustration, anger, anxiety, and fear, depending on the threat. Cognitively, I already mentioned, we're going to have problems with concentrating, remembering, making decisions, and even a loss of humor. Kind of on the border between cognitive response and the next topic of coping is Richard Lazarus's theory of cognitive appraisal. We already saw him in the emotion theory when he talked about, he's one of the theories of emotion, saying that there's a cognitive element that we take in. You should go back and review those, because I think those are tricky, but for now we're just going to focus on Lazarus's theory about stress. He said it's a two-step process. The first cognitive thing we do, our primary thing, is we assess the threat, and then secondarily we assess our ability to respond. So the primary appraisal is how threatening is the event to us, and do we see it as a threat or as a challenge, or is the harm already done? If you're driving and you suddenly have a deer run into the road, is that a threat? Yes. It's not a challenge unless you're a certain kind of driver. And but if you've already run off the road and slammed into a tree and you're sitting there with the front buckled in, it's still stressful, but the harm is already done, and so it's a different perception of the threat. And then the secondary appraisal is, how am I going to deal with this? Do I have the resources to deal with it, and what am I going to do? The book has a graph of this kind of two-step process. This one's a little bit different. Both are fine. You get the stressor, the primary appraisal, and then if you perceive it as a threat that's going to either harm you or lead to some kind of negative consequences, you then have to deal with, how am I going to deal with it? And if you think you have effective options, then your stress is lowered and you have a low threat. If you feel like you don't have any good options, that's when it's a very stressful event. On to coping. There are two kinds of coping: problem-focused and emotion-focused. So problem-focused is, what your parents tell you to do. It's like, well, why don't you go take care of the problem? Call the agency, or go talk to your teacher, or whatever it is. So you eliminate the source of the stress or reduce its impact. Emotion focused is where you don't actually deal with the problem directly, but you deal with the emotions. So I feel better, I went and talked it out with a friend. The book also has a number of sections talking about how social support can affect how well you cope. Cultural and religious factors can affect how you cope, and then it has sections on things you can do. Meditation, they talk about two different kinds of meditation, and becoming a more optimistic thinker. The last section I'm going to focus on would be personality and stress. So you've probably heard of type A and type B personalities. Um, type A are competitive and ambitious. They hate to waste time. They're easily annoyed. Type B are mellow. They're not that competitive or driven. They're easygoing. They're kind of relaxed and at peace. Um, they don't necessarily accomplish as much as type A. There's also a type C, less well known. They're like type B in that they're pleasant and keep the peace, but it's because they're internalizing their anger. So they don't express emotions well. They just kind of swallow it all. They especially don't express negative emotions well. Um, type A are at higher risk for heart disease and problems due to stress. Type C are actually have a higher risk of cancer because the way they deal with things can actually build up stress and affect their immune system, apparently. This type A, B, and C is criticized often as too simplistic, and many people don't fit neatly into any one category, but some of us do. The key with the type A is, in terms of the risk for heart disease, is are they a hostile type A? So you can be driven and ambitious, but not aggressive or hostile about it. And those types of people don't seem to experience the higher risk of heart disease. So it's really the hostility of the type A that causes the problems. There's also something called the hardy personality. The idea that some people seem to thrive on stress, and those people seem to have the 3 C's, commitment, control, and challenge. They are committed to their values or beliefs or their own identity and comfortable with that. They are have a strong sense of self-efficacy, if you remember that. They feel like they are in control of their lives and what happens to them. And then they see things as challenges, not threats. And that relates to our final thing, the explanatory style. When stuff happens, how do you explain it? Are you optimistic about it or pessimistic about it? And obviously the optimists tend to handle stress better. Okay, that's it. 17 minutes. What do you need to know? You've got 2 theories of stress now, Selye's and Lazarus's. You need to know what stress is. It's our response to challenges or threats. You need to know distress and eustress, the 3 types of stressors, the SRRS, general adaptation syndrome of Selye, coping with stress, and personality types and stress. And that is it. Congratulations. See you in class.